everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Akanksha Balani. I lead the Alliance for AWS at Intel for the region of APJ, and I'm also the Global AI and HPC lead. It's my pleasure for us to have a fireside chat and have you guys experience what we're going to talk about today, which is driving country growth for tech inclusivity. It's our honor and our pleasure to have Professor Dean Ho with us. A little bit about Professor Dean Ho. We could actually talk about him for about 30 minutes, just about what he's accomplished so far. But a small summary of what Dean's profile is that he is currently Provost's chair professor, director of the N1 Institute for Health, director of the Institute of Digital Medicine, and the head of the Department of Biomedical Engineering at NUS. Professor Ho and collaborators successfully developed and validated Curate AI, a powerful digital medical platform that has optimized human treatment for broad indications ranging from oncology to infectious diseases. He co-led the first in-human clinical trials that have resulted in completely halted disease progression and durable patient responses that substantially outperform standards of care approaches. Professor Ho is also a fellow of the U.S. National Academy of Inventors in the Americas. Welcome, Professor, and welcome, Dean.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. It's our absolute honor. So to the topic, Dean, on driving country growth with tech inclusivity, we shall try and keep the focus on a specific technology that has kind of transformed the industry and the national impetus with the data that's come upon us, which is the technology of AI. And what we'd love to get is your perspective from a healthcare, from a research, as well as an academic focus on how you've seen AI actually make a difference in the industries. So specifically, maybe what I'd love to catch up with you on is how have you, in your experience, seen AI making a difference in the segment of healthcare?
Yes, so I think looking at AI in healthcare, there are a lot of important segments where it's making impact. I think one of the earliest areas we've seen AI impact healthcare is in diagnostics. When we look at the ability for AI to empower and help clinicians make more definitive diagnoses for various cancers and beyond, I think that's certainly an area of excitement. Something that we focus on heavily at Wisdom, or the Institute for Digital Medicine and N1, with collaborators in the field, is in the area of intervention or treatment. I think this is an area where AI can make a lot of impact because in order to optimize care, I think there's something that we have to align with, which is we know that all patients are different from each other, but patients are different from themselves over time. And so when we think about how dynamic people are when they undergo treatment, I think AI can be quite powerful when we think about how we can dynamically modulate and adjust care as we move along. And so we've looked at diagnostics as well as therapeutics. I think an area that's always going to come up is data. And I think as we continue with the discussion today, a lot of what we've heard about with AI is big data. And I think that for areas like diagnostics and things like drug discovery, big data plays a vital role, right? We need a lot of it, of actionable data to drive insights in those segments. For intervention, I think something exciting we're now starting to see is it's not necessarily about how much data we have, but how that data is acquired, all the way to the point where even small data can result in profound improvements to patient outcomes, especially in therapy. And so AI in healthcare, diagnostics, therapeutics, as well as solidifying the role that data can have in impacting both of those segments.
That's very insightful, Dean. I know that you also I think everybody knows now about your build on Curate AI, and I think that's a very powerful platform. for actually helping drive disease mitigation almost. So maybe you could talk to us about the journey that you as well as your collaborators actually went through in discovering the need for Curate AI, and then how did you actually drive a scalable experience that could actually carry forward what you have built to multiple other diseases or multiple other ways in which or experiences for patients. It would be really amazing for the audiences to know what your journey actually was to develop a need to get to Curate AI, and then how you drove it to scale.
It's a great question. And I think Curate AI symbolizes the concepts of accessibility and inclusivity. Now, to start things off, earlier I mentioned that we know patients are different from each other, but they are different from themselves over time. And so I think that in order to truly personalize healthcare, first off, I think it's important to have a complementary interaction between big data approaches and small data approaches. Now, when a patient comes in with cancer, for example, I think a lot of the big data approaches have been pivotal in helping to select the therapies that are applicable to those patients. The thing is with cancer therapy or any type of therapy, there's this notion that if a drug or a combination of drugs don't work on that patient, that they'll never work for that patient. And so this is where something like Curate AI comes in. The traditional strategies for prescribing or recommending treatment for patients is to give high dose and fixed dose. And when it doesn't work, we move on to a second line, third line, fourth line therapy and beyond. And what happens there is there's this notion that good drugs, but given at the wrong dose, can have no efficacy. That's important because that, again, there's this perception that these drugs would have never worked, right? And so I'll give you a specific example. There was a patient that we had worked on in collaboration with a wonderful team of clinicians, and the patient was responding to treatment. But the treatment was very toxic to the point where the patient was going to quit treatment. There was another patient we were working on where a second line therapy was administered and it appeared that the patient was not responding at all. And with these patients, aside from just giving high and fixed dose, what we did was based upon how Curate is implemented, we obtained a small number of data points of how the patients respond to variable dosing. So they tried different doses, all within proper limits, but we also measure their response at these different doses. And with these, 3, 4, 5 data points, we're able to construct a patient-specific profile. And what this profile does is in both of these patients' cases, it recommended a reduction, a substantial reduction in both of their doses of one of the drugs in their regimen. For the first patient that was responding, but the treatment was exceptionally toxic, in fact, at the reduced dose, 50% reduction, their efficacy went up, and as expected, their toxicity went down, right? And so the clinical team came in and said, hey, we don't do this in oncology. We don't go up and down on the dosing, right? But in this case, they dropped the dose and the efficacy went up, all right? Not just the toxicity going down. Second patient, what was remarkable was that this patient originally at high dose did not appear to respond at all to treatment. But just by dropping the dose of one of the drugs, their cancer markers immediately went from increasing to flipping and then decreasing. And so what this tells us is this is a patient that appeared to have no response to this treatment, but in fact, they could respond, right? And not only could they respond at a lower dose. Good drugs, wrong dose, right, can give the misperception that drugs don't work. And this is missing a vital opportunity for this patient to have high quality of life care. Now, when we think about Curate and scalability, I think what's exciting about Curate is that it is a small data approach so that the infrastructure needed is minimal. Importantly, from the concept of inclusivity, implementing Curate is an interaction between certainly our technology teams, but it's an interaction with the clinical teams. And depending on the treatment or the disease we're going after, clinical team means doctors, it means nurses, it means pharmacists and beyond, allied health. And at the same time, it involves building in the patient, of course, and their caregivers into this workflow, right?
Mm-hmm.
So AI itself is important, but at Wisdom and at N1 in biomedical engineering, we have an important ethos, which is technology alone cannot transform healthcare, right? To change the practice of medicine, we need seamless integration between different disciplines, right? And what I've just mentioned, healthcare providers, technologists, that is not enough either, right? At Wisdom, we have behavioral scientists interviewing healthcare providers to understand how we can better make sure that we're trying to make their lives easier in order to make the patients' lives easier. And when it comes to inclusivity, it's important to note that when we implement Curate, we do not aggregate large patient populations worth of data to treat the individual. Patients number 1 through 100 have no bearing on patient number 101. We use only a patient's own data to manage only their own care, right? And so when we think about data set, right, the data set that we use, because we're only using an individual's own data, hopefully we have an opportunity to mitigate issues of data bias and applying suboptimal patient information to the next patient that walks in, because this truly is N of 1 treatment. Only a patient's own data to manage only their own care. So in terms of the infrastructure, our work already in understanding how to build Curate into the workflows, right? And the fact that we are complementary to big data, but at the same time implementing Curate as a small data approach, hopefully we are simultaneously addressing many of the questions of scalability, accessibility, as well as inclusivity.
Amazing, absolutely. A very strong platform, I think, and a really great example of how collaborations and getting everyone together on one page towards direction is so important. Dean, while you were talking about, getting the technologists and the doctors, as well as, the scientists and the researchers together, tell me about the journey of working with each other, because the technologist would be like, this is the infrastructure we require for us to do this. And this is, the level of scalability we're managing to get. And then you've got the doctors basically saying, we're questioning the regular mechanics of how they work. And then you've got the scientists and the researchers actually giving them anecdotal information almost about what needs to happen to take patient, 0 from bad health to good health almost. So what was that journey like? Was there apprehension? Was there, the need for collaboration? Was there ease? Talk to me about that journey.
Yes, I think for any emerging technology to truly have a chance to be integrated into healthcare workflows or any other type of workflow, I think there has to be a candid discussion and admission of what we don't know, what each segment doesn't know. Technology alone cannot transform healthcare. So I think we knew early on that we couldn't bring Curate or the concept of Curate into a clinician and say, this is the way it has to be, or do this. I think we had to walk into this conversation mostly with questions and ask, what are the typical therapies for a patient? How do you decide the therapies? What kind of dosing modulation can we do? Are you able to help provide this type of data? What should we think ahead about, et cetera? And these discussions, I think, paved the way for not just setting up a technology deployment roadmap, but it was to really kind of build an understanding between the teams, and importantly, an empathy, I think, between teams as well. When we think about empathy in healthcare, we think mostly about doctor to patient or nurse to patient. I think there's an interdisciplinary empathy that has to exist for a technology to even have a chance at clinical validation, let alone full deployment. Right. And so what's important here is I think we built a very strong rapport with the clinical team so that we understood all the steps that were needed to sign off on a dose recommendation. We learned quickly that sometimes clinicians want multiple options, of dose recommendations. We learn from the pharmacists that when we recommend variable dosing guidances, that we have to consider how many pills are involved with the different recommendations. Sure, maybe we recommend a lower dose for the patient, which will help reduce toxicity, but sometimes lower dosing, depending on how the pills are set up for that therapy, lower dosing may equal more pills, actually. More pills that are each small versus less pills that are each a little bit larger, right? And so these elements of considering what the patients are going through, what their caregivers are going through, matters. And so that's why when we think about beyond just clinical team and technical team, we have to think about behavioral sciences. We have to ask ourselves, what are the barriers that are in place that we have to overcome in terms of logistics, right? Healthcare economics. One area we wanted to think about was what are the cost factors we have to consider to make this a sustainable platform, right? And I'll give you an example. You know, we have a study where we were able to then look at how much cost we were saving a patient with lower drug dosing here. And that was an expensive drug that was being used, as well as the potential for reducing readmission into the hospital, which saves the patient money and saves the healthcare system money as well, right? And so, by the way, one thing I'll mention is one of Wisdom's first hires was not a technologist, was not a clinician, but came from the insurance industry, right? Because sometimes to understand if an early stage technology has a chance, we have to be guided by established knowledge of how technologies get reimbursed, how they really achieve adoption, right? And so this workflow is extensive, it's multidisciplinary, and the earlier on a technology team seeks guidance, right? Collaborative guidance with segments of this workflow, I think the better chance that tech has in terms of being truly adopted and built into workflows.
Amazing. Absolutely. Completely agree. Dean, let's switch gears to, basically directional for other, audiences right now in the healthcare domain. Which organizations and approaches are you actually learning from? With Curate AI, that's one strong platform. I'm sure you're building other platforms. What have you learned from, this crazy deluge of data and the need for AI to actually be implemented across the various layers? What have you learned? What kind of organizations have given you motivational approaches, as well as where do you see the future of what can happen in your domain as well as in your department?
Yes, that's a great question. And I think that something exciting I'll mention is, I'll give a couple examples. So the first one is the hospitals, the multiple hospitals that we work with, one of which is the National University Hospital, with which I've been collaborating for years, even before I moved to Singapore. And what I think has been really exciting is it's this interface of clinical innovation, of certainly rigor in evaluating potential platforms to collaborate on, and accessibility, right? I think that the accessibility of actually our entire ecosystem in Singapore is a major catalyst for life-saving advances. We've had cases where where patients' families have reached out, where clinicians have reached out for help in terms of potentially designing these N-of-1 trials for patients. And when this happens, this kind of initiates this workflow, this chain of calls and emails that span from finance offices to ethics to medical board review to data protection offices, legal, between different entities and beyond. And one can imagine that without the accessibility in place, these trials are precluded, initiations completely precluded because the patients just don't have time. And
Right.
what we've seen happen is some of these first-in-kind study designs get cleared and studies initiated within weeks, right? We're talking about life-saving advances. And of course, it took time. It took time to engage everything from the regulatory community to the clinical community and ethics medical board review. It took time to establish a roadmap and track record for what we do. But once these roadmaps were established, we are able to deploy life-saving studies, right? And so learning about how important accessibility is when we think about NUH, when we think about our amazing regulatory system here, when we think about the other hospitals here that, as we've seen with COVID, can band together, right, to initiate trials rigorously reviewed, but built upon impactful technologies and solutions, et cetera, lives get saved, right? And I think accessibility is the word. And it's unlike anything I've ever seen before. And we're still learning, right? When we move beyond oncology and we expand into areas like digital therapeutics, using gaming and software as treatment, that has necessitated discussions with agencies we never thought we would be speaking to at this point in our development roadmap. But given the opportunity and privilege to engage early, which we've done, we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot on how to de-risk. We've learned a lot in terms of what the patients and the caregivers need. And when we initiate this kind of co-creation type approach, I think that the solutions have a better chance of helping the community. And so I think one of the biggest things I've learned is the importance of accessibility. And again, I'm deeply grateful to be a part of this ecosystem here in Singapore, because it's given us the privilege and the opportunity to help people through these accelerated timeframes.
Absolutely. And I think that everyone has had a very different experience in terms of accessibility in the pandemic times, where not everyone can actually get to a hospital, for whatever the reason be. So absolutely trying to identify the right mechanisms to drive the best access to healthcare is absolutely very pivotal. From your journey as collaborations with the technologists, what's your views on how accessibility can be supported with cloud, as well as performance that can be driven by computing capability?
That's a great question. As you mentioned, COVID has really shined a light on the importance of being able to boost healthcare accessibility, both for patients who need care, as well as for the deployment of clinical trials, right? Because I think when COVID happened, a lot of trials were halted, right? And while we have established treatment methods, which are vital, at the same time, the medical community still needs to develop future innovations as well. And so I think this interfaces nicely with something I just mentioned, which is digital therapeutics, right? Using software as treatment, because this is something where it can be done remotely, right? Remote cognitive training, multitasking training is something we're looking at. And when we have scenarios of, looking at last year, we had patients around the world who were at home, right? My parents, 75 years old, at home. Was there an opportunity to look at something like digital therapeutics, digital intervention as a way for remote treatment now, or just for supportive or preventive care? Now, digital therapy and interventions not only for intervention, because if we look at some of the platforms we're developing, when we start looking at scoring, performance scores of digital intervention, this gives us a way to remotely monitor potentially patient cognitive performance, right? And I think COVID has made it apparent that decentralizing healthcare, care at home, is going to become increasingly important. Now, if we were to put a lot of what we do on a tablet, which we're doing, I think that certainly can boost accessibility, but there's also another element we have to consider, which is there's a segment of the population where digital platforms are not as accessible already, right? So I think that when we think about deploying digital, I think it's important, it's a very, I think, intriguing opportunity and important opportunity to start thinking early about, how can we first start with enhancing accessibility to digital, digital first. Then we can start thinking about expanding the applications that digital to healthcare. And something that I think has been really cool that we've been delving into is collaborating with teams to create instruction manuals in video form, in print form, to inform users how to engage with digital in the first place before we get to the gaming, right? The digital intervention. And that, as part of our co-creation process, has been very educational, and we are grateful for that. Because I think when we think about accessibility, it's certainly accessibility to decentralized healthcare, digitally optimized healthcare, but accessibility to digital at all, right? And I think there are a lot of opportunities to continue to learn in that space.
Great, fantastic. We have a question from the audience, Dean. Precision medicine is shifting from big data to personalized data. How soon do you think widespread deployment of personal genomics clinically will happen in healthcare industry in Singapore?
It's a great question. And what's cool about Singapore's ecosystem, we have this amazing precision medicine community of friends and colleagues. And I think that the first part of the question raises an important point, which is I think truly personalizing healthcare is going to be at the interface of both big data and small data, or this personalized data. I think it's truly complementary. And I think that this also continues to raise the question of, depending on the specific segment of healthcare, is it a question of how much data we have or how the data is acquired? And I'm going to give an example. When a clinical trial is started for patients for a drug, for example, they are randomized to get either a low dose, a middle dose, or a high dose. And you can collect a lot of data from a lot of patients who get a low dose, a middle dose, or a high dose. Now, if a patient is given a high dose of treatment in this clinical trial and they don't respond, the disease gets worse, super toxic, they are removed from the trial. And that's one of the reasons why we bring a lot of patients in to account for a lot of what's happening. But we will never have known if this patient could have responded to a lower dose, because they were randomized to get the high dose, didn't respond. We'll never have known they could have responded to a lower dose. And as I mentioned at the very beginning of the Fireside, we've had patients who did not respond at all to high dose, but they actually responded to a lower dose, right? And so what if, instead of randomizing each patient to a specific dose, we give each patient the low, the middle, the high, right? And depending on the disease, if it's very aggressive, you can go high, middle, low, high, middle, as long as they are given variable dosing and corresponding data, which is only a little bit more data. Learn a little bit more from each person. And what happens is, we're not trying to low dose every cancer patient. That is not our goal, right? Our goal is to find more responders, because we know we have patients that appear to not respond when they can, right? And so when we think about deployment of personalized strategies to get data, I don't think we're too far away. And I think what's important, though, is to be mindful of what that personalized data looks like. Genomics is a critical part of it because it can help inform what therapies might be effective. At the same time, good drugs, wrong dose, there's a misperception that the drug is not effective, right? The genomics have given us an extraordinary capability to start strong. But if we start looking at other data, variable dosing, corresponding efficacy for each patient, how we acquire that data, then we will have this kind of full workflow in place. And I think, we're already looking at this through various trials that we have now, which is very progressive, and it's helping patients, right? And it's powered by the accessibility of all the stakeholders here, right? That's important to emphasize. And so I think, could be a few years away, but right now, I think we are already innovating how trials are designed and how we are acquiring data, I think, in a more optimal fashion.
Thank you so much, Dean. I know that we're at the top of the hour. So really wanted to summarize, I think, very, very valuable insights, Dean, and I'm hoping that the audience has really learned a lot from your journey and your directions for healthcare and applying, I guess, technology into healthcare to help actually save lives. But the key takeaway from this is the need to focus on accessibility, the power of collaborations, and ensuring that everyone's in it together to identify the right convergence of technology access as well as your domain need. Identifying the actual value of applying technologies like AI, like cloud computing, and driving the strongest performance to help us actually save lives, driving those use cases and the successes that you want to drive, I think are the three main points that everybody that's trying to get a convergence on technology for their specific industry into success mode, make it about performance, make it about bringing down TCO, and make it about actual value and impact to lives. So with that, thank you so much, Dean. Thank you for your amazing insights and expertise. Thank you, audience, for listening. This is Akanksha from Intel signing off. Thank you, Dean.
Thanks, everybody.
We'll be back after a quick break for our next panel on digital recovery.